Good morning, or good afternoon if you're 7th hour. We're going to go over some stuff that I know you've already technically gone over between Friday and yesterday, but we're going to go ahead and hit it anyway. So we're going to kind of review over some of those ecosystem vocabulary terms and things like that. So, okay. Autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are going to be organisms that can make their own energy. They do it automatically, kind of like that prefix auto. So like an automatic transmission car will go ahead and shift automatically. It doesn't need something else to tell it to shift. It just does it on its own. So it's kind of the same reasoning behind an automatic or an autotroph. Okay, so they're able to make their own energy there. So they're going to be organisms that basically can go through photosynthesis. So if you can go through photosynthesis, you are going to be an autotroph. So just to kind of clarify a little bit more for you. A heterotroph is going to be an organism that relies on other organisms. It's got to eat other organisms, to be able to get its food or energy. So they can't make their own food. So we're obviously going to be heterotrophs. Troph, by the way, is referring to energy, and then those prefixes auto or hetero are referring to on their own or relying on others. So that's what those mean. So as we're talking about some of these words within the ecosystems, you're going to want to know those words auto and heterotroph. I don't know if you've heard of those before or not. You may or may not have. So, but I figured I'd tell them to you anyway. These words I know you went over yesterday on your little vocabulary wheel, and I'm fairly certain that they've taught you those or you've gone over those in elementary, so I'm not too terribly worried about these. But with your first one, producer. Producers are going to be organisms that are autotrophic, so they can make their own energy. They are the ecosystem, mostly because they hold the least amount of energy in the entire ecosystem. So in order for you to be able to get enough energy to function, you have to consume quite a few producers because they just don't have a lot of energy in them. And so anybody that eats producers has to eat a lot of them. So that's why cows are constantly grazing, just because there's not a lot of nutritional value in the grass, and so they're constantly having to eat to replenish that energy supply. So, and they're considered to be the bottom of the food chain. But very, very important. So, because they are what keeps the entire ecosystem going. Without those producers, you don't really basically have an ecosystem, because everybody relies on them in some way. They may not directly eat them, but they do rely on them. So, your next level is going to be your consumers. Your consumers do exactly what their name says. They consume other organisms, so they're going to be heterotrophic. They cannot photosynthesize. They can't make their own energy. So they're going to have to eat somebody else in order to get that energy that they need to survive. So now I've left you the most amount of room on these guys simply because they do have some subcategories, and so you will probably want to go ahead and leave these or write these down. Even though you may know, I might tell you something a little bit different. Who knows? But so they're all heterotrophs. So the three different subclasses of your consumers are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Okay? With your herbivores, they're going to eat the producers in the system and only the producers. So they're going to be plant eaters. So that's why I have pictures of the cows there. So, or the cattle. So you've got those guys. Then you've got your carnivores. They are going to eat the herbivores. Sometimes they could eat other carnivores or other omnivores. It doesn't necessarily have to be just eating an herbivore. It could be a variety of them. So Then you've got your carnivores. Your carnivores are going to, oh, I already did that, sorry. Your omnivores. Your omnivores are going to eat both producers and they're going to eat the herbivores. Again, they could eat another omnivore, they can eat another carnivore. So yeah. Typically, your omnivores and your carnivores are going to be considered secondary consumers, and your herbivores are going to be considered they're going to be considered the primary consumers because they're going to be the lower lower on the food chain. So now an herbivore could also be a primary consumer. So they could be. But typically a carnivore is going to be considered to be a secondary consumer for sure. And then omnivores usually are considered to be secondary consumers. So in theory, you could have a tertiary or third consumer if there's an omnivore or carnivore who eats a secondary consumer. So, all right, your next group of organisms in an ecosystem are called the detritivores. They're oftentimes called the scavengers. So they are going to be the garbage disposal of your ecosystem. And their job is going to be to feed off of dead organisms. So they're going to feed off dead organisms. They are going to be considered technically heterotrophic because they do need to consume something to be able to get their energy. However, we don't really consider them omnivores or carnivores since they're scavenging off of already dead organisms. So I think typically considered in order to be considered a carnivore or an herbivore, you got to be consuming a live organism. So. A decomposer is the next, and with these guys, they're going to break down all of the dead organisms, and they're going to recycle those nutrients back in for those producers to use. So once the dead organism has been mostly picked off of, and now it's time to actually start breaking it down into like the basic carbon and oxygen and stuff like that, that would be the job of your of these guys, your decomposers. So bacteria, earthworms, things like that. They're actually going to decompose the stuff, not just eat a dead organism. So, okay. Kind of towards the bottom, it's like halfway down now, where we've gotten the left side and the right side on your little outline. Now you've got energy transfer, I think, underneath there. So, what is energy transfer? It is when energy is, like I said, moved from one organism to another. And that's going to happen when an organism gets eaten. It will transfer the energy that it contained, and it will go to the organism that's eating it. So that's kind of what happens there is the molecules. So either the stored energy in their fat or their muscles or something is going to be broken down and transferred into chemical energy for the organism that's eating it. and then that organism will store it either as, or give it off or transfer it in like heat energy or mechanical energy to move or whatever. So they'll transform it into whatever they need. Now the thing with this particular thing to note with the energy transfer, it's not 100% efficient. So whenever an organism is eaten, some of it is lost, given off as heat, some of it's just decomposed. There's no way to get 100%, there's no way to harvest 100% of the energy that an organism contains. So when you eat a carrot, all of the energy that was in that carrot, some of it gets lost. It's not all transferable. Some of it you can't some of it we can't break down. We don't have the enzymes to decompose all of it or break it down to digest it fully. And so because of that, some of that energy is lost. So that's also one reason why the herbivores have to consume so much of the producer. So because they're going to ultimately lose what little energy is in that producer. So not all of it, but they'll lose some of it. So that should be written down somewhere as what's lost in energy transfer, and that would be some of it. Some of the energy is lost, non-transferable, or given off as heat or something like that. Okay. The next one that I think is on your little list is magnification. Now that's not talking about making things bigger in terms of being able to see it, like the magnification of your microscopes that we worked with earlier this year. So what that actually is talking about is making things bigger, but not in terms of sight. It's talking about making things bigger in terms of poisons. So one example is mercury poisoning in fish. If there was a problem with mercury in a stream or a lake or something, and maybe there wasn't enough mercury in there to kill off the fish, but the fish ingested some of that mercury, but it wasn't enough to kill off the fish. If you lived solely off of that fish, and you ate, 5 fish, while the fish weren't necessarily affected by that little bit of poison, you eating 5 fish, you now have the amount of mercury that 5 fish had. So that's kind of what they mean by magnification. It makes things larger the higher up you go up the food chain. So it could also be some sort of pesticide put on plants. It might not be enough to affect the plant itself, but a cow who's going to eat a whole bunch of grass now has all the pesticide from all of the grass, and so that's kind of magnified and made more dangerous. So that's what we mean by magnification, making poisons more toxic because you're consuming more of them the higher up the food chain you go. So that's probably what I would write there under magnification. Consuming more poisons, the higher up the food chain you go. And if you wanted to put in parentheses, like I said, pesticides or the mercury poisoning. Now, on that worksheet, we talked a little bit about food chains. So generally, you can show either a food chain, you can show that flow of energy through either a food chain or a food web. So a food chain is going to be just one route. A food web is going to show usually the flow through an entire ecosystem. So not just one particular way. Now, for some of you, I told you that the sun wasn't technically a part of the food chain, and that's still correct, but for all intents and purposes, I went ahead and showed it to you here because that just kind of shows you that all of the energy comes from the sun. So all of the energy that enters an ecosystem comes from the sun through the heat and the sunlight. So that's where all of our energy comes from. Then we've got little mushrooms and plants that are going to grow because of their exposure to the sunlight. And then from there, you've got your little caterpillar guy who's going to consume your grass and your mushrooms. And then he's going to, and then that energy is going to get transferred again to the sparrow who's going to eat the caterpillar. And then the cat might eat the robin there. So, and again, if you remember, I know we talked about it, but your energy arrows always go from the eaten to the eater, because we're not showing who's getting eaten. We're showing how all of the energy gets transferred. So again, it's not how everything happens. It's showing you how the energy is transferred. So it's going to go from the eaten to the eater. So same in a food web. It's just going to show you multiple pathways that the energy would go. So it gives you a bigger picture, especially with potential problems that could have occurred. Through your ecosystem. Okay, so your next thing, food webs. I know we talked a little bit about the food chains. So, by the way, all you really need to write down for a food chain on your notes is that it just shows the energy transfer through one pathway. That's really all I'm going for. Is it's showing the energy pathway for one pathway. That's it. So, on the right side, by the way, you're on your back if you haven't figured that out. On the back side of your notes. Sorry. Okay, so on the right side now, you've got your food webs. These are going to show the energy transfer through an entire ecosystem, or at least attempt to show you the entire transfer through an ecosystem. Oftentimes you're going to have 3 to 4 trophic levels. So for these guys, I would say for a food web, you probably want to write down several different food chains put together. It's going to be made up of 3 to 4 trophic levels, and this allows you to see the relationships between the organisms. So not only how is the energy transferred, but it's going to show you how the relationships all form. Who relies on who for food? With this, your producers are going to be on the first level. Now, they're going to be all over the place. So they may or may not be in nice straight lines. They might. Usually food webs are going to be in like different, like an actual circle. So it's hard to see what exactly we mean by the first level. Oftentimes, especially with these guys, just because there's no actual like legit level. You'd have to put them in an actual line, and oftentimes they're not put in lines. So, but if you were to put them in lines, they would be in the first level. Okay. And then you've got your herbivores on the secondary level. Some other consumers will be there. Not just herbivores, it could be an omnivore too, if they're eating some of those plants there. And then your primary and secondary consumers are going to be 3rd and 4th levels. So those would be like your your carnivores and your omnivores. Some omnivores, so depending on what they're eating. Oftentimes these consumers are called predators, with the exception of your herbivores. Some people group herbivores as a primary consumer, some don't, but just your omnivores and carnivores are going to be called predators. Your herbivores aren't usually considered predators, they're usually considered the prey. Now, there are some omnivores and carnivores that can be prey and predator, depending on where they're located in the food chain. So, why look at all of this stuff? because when you look at your food webs, you're able to see what happens if what could happen to an entire ecosystem if one organism is overhunted or if it becomes endangered or something like that. You can then look and see how the entire ecosystem gets affected based off of the absence, or it could be the other way around. It could be maybe an organism is thriving and you have a whole bunch of one particular organism. So it could go either way. It doesn't have to just be the absence of an animal or a plant. It could be, an overabundance of something. But that's why we use the food chain to kind of study these types of things. And generally, the lower you go, the more havoc it could that one change might do. So if you have something happening to the producers, that's going to have a huge effect on everybody else around. If you have it occurring to a secondary consumer, the amount of change might not be quite as much because everybody is not necessarily going to be affected by that. So usually the lower, the better off you are. Usually. Usually the lower off, the worse it is. Sorry. The worse it gets. So. Okay. Last thing. Your length of your food chain. This is going to be determined by the number of organisms that you've got, particularly at the bottommost level. So if you have a large population of producers, you can support more consumers at the top end. If you don't have a lot of producers at the bottom, you can't have a very big ecosystem because everybody depends on those producers. So I think it says length of food chain on your notes. You just put the number of organisms at each trophic level is going to determine how many consumers it can support. So like I said, you need way more of those producers. So you're always going to have more producers. You're always going to have fewer consumers at the top. You're going to have more primary consumers than you will have secondary consumers. So just because you've got a finite amount of resources, a finite amount, or a very specific, that's what finite means, a very set number or a set amount of resources. So I've got here, you're always going to have more grass than gazelles and wildebeests. And you're always going to have more gazelles and wildebeests than lions. So it's just how everything works out. So this kind of wraps up this part of the lesson. So you're going to want to hold on to these. You've got a quiz over these particular ones here in a little on Friday. So if you do have any questions, like I said, just email me because I'll be able to answer anything that you might have since I'm in the conference room. I'm staying after tomorrow after school for tutoring, so if you do need some help, be sure to come in. And then I'll also be here Thursday morning at 7:15, and there's a decent chance that I'll be here about 7:30 Friday morning. So if you want any last-minute studying, be sure to stop by. I'll quiz you. Oftentimes I'll look at the quiz and kind of ask you some questions that'll narrow it down so you have an idea as to what's going to be on the quiz. So I highly recommend that you come in if you don't get this. So, but like I said, if you do have questions, just email me. Otherwise, have a good day.